be joined by our Capital Historical Society board member and NPR reporter Ron Elving, who will fill in for our CEO and president Jane Campbell, who usually does the moderating. So go ahead and take it from here, Ron.
Thank you, Vincent. It is a pleasure to have the opportunity to stand in for Jane and to host this webinar on a matter of the greatest concern to Americans, not only in retrospect as we remember January 6th of 2021, but as we contemplate the election of 2024. And we're very fortunate to have with us today our guest, Professor Alan Jenkins from the Harvard Law School. Professor Jenkins teaches at Harvard. He is a professor of jurisprudence, talks a lot about the Supreme Court, but also has wide-ranging interests and considers himself a politically active person as well, and also has a media studies master's degree from the New School of Social Research in New York. So welcome, Professor Jenkins.
Thank you so much for having me, Ron. Thank you to the Society, and thank you personally for just being a voice of calm in tumultuous times. So it's a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you very much, Professor. We, as you may know, have conducted an oral history project as the Capital Historical Society, interviewing people, everyone who was willing to be interviewed, who had been present in the Capitol that day, including many of the police officers who were on duty and very much involved in what went on that day, but also many of the staff members, members of Congress, and so on, who wanted to recall in a personal oral history kind of way what their very normal, if you will, day as it began turned into, and how it turned out to be so traumatic for them personally. So not so much trying to do it as a historian, as a formal historian would do, but just talking about it the way people would memorialize it in a diary. So we've been conducting that oral history project now for several years. That's quite different from the purposes of a graphic novel. And so we want you to share with us what you and Gan Golan, your co-author, and your illustrator, Will Rosado, had in mind, and how you feel you've been able to bring this to a new audience.
Yeah, well, thank you. And so for so many of us, and I'm guessing for most of the people tuning into the webinar, the events of January 6th, 2021 were really an attack on a building, but just as importantly, more importantly, an attack on our democracy, on our democratic values, and on our Constitution. And almost as quickly as it ended, we started to hear, kind of a rewriting of history, of kind of intentional forgetting of what happened that day, and, a new, inaccurate versions of what occurred, kind of denying that there was a violent attack, denying the other parts of the insurrection, that there was a fake elector scheme in which the votes of the people and the Electoral College votes were, there was an attempt to subvert them, the arm twisting and intimidation of election officials. And so I found myself waking up again and again at 4 a.m., literally worrying about our democracy and worrying about the fact that we seem to already be forgetting or misremembering, and at the very least, not learning the lessons of that day. And so I'm a law professor. I could have written a law review article that would have been read by tens of people, scholars around the country, but it seemed to me that it was important to reach a broader audience, and also people who care about our democracy, but weren't necessarily tuned in, or don't necessarily listen to NPR every day as I do, or watch CNN, didn't have time to read the 800+ page House Select Committee report on the insurrection. And so I've always been a comic book fan, a pop culture guy. And so I thought that would be a good way to reach a broader audience and a different audience who maybe were persuadable on the events of that day and why they matter. And so I reached out to my friend and frequent co-conspirator, Gan Golan, who is himself a New York Times best-selling graphic novelist for past work he's done, Unemployed Man, for example. And he said, I'm in. and we were off to the races. So if you'll indulge me, I wanted to share a few images from the series and maybe just a little bit about why we did it, and then hopefully we can jump back into our conversation.
By all means, please do.
Thank you. So hopefully you can see my screen.
Yes.
Great. So as I noted, we really view the events of January 6th as an attack at the heart of American democracy. Like you, I've spent a fair amount of time in the Capitol building itself. I was an intern to the Senate Judiciary Committee many, many years ago, and I really watched with horror as that building was, in my view, desecrated by violence and property destruction. And it also made us wonder, Gan and I wonder, what if the attack, the insurrection, had been successful? And the more we dug, the more we realized how close we actually came to a successful insurrection and coup d'etat and all that that entails. And so that emerged as the story that we wanted to tell. And in the tradition of speculative fiction, so rooted in actual events, but imagining an alternate reality in the tradition of George Orwell's 1984, or Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale, or the Twilight Zone from back in the day, really imagining what could have happened as a cautionary tale. And so we let our imagination go, but really focusing on things that actually were said or done and taking them just a bit further to their natural conclusions. So you see the golden statue of President Trump holding a Bible, the Lincoln Memorial with a Confederate flag draped across it, sometimes with humor, sometimes really quite serious, recognizing the white supremacist roots of the attack on the Capitol, the anti-Semitism that drove a lot of the militias and the attack on the Capitol, recognizing how dark things could go very quickly. The labeling of the media as enemies of the people and threats of violence therein. And as you know, there's been a significant increase in violent attacks on journalists in the last 2 years, even as there has been a rise in white supremacist hate and anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, transphobia, and other types of hate violence. And so we really wanted to illustrate the implications there. But we also wanted to establish an historical record. Some of the things, stranger than fiction, many of them, that actually did occur in the time leading up to and including January 6th, 2021. And we wanted to be clear with readers about what was rooted in documentation and facts, what was purely speculative, and what was really fiction. And so I won't dwell on it, but there's actually a key in issue 2, which is the one that is most rooted in real facts, that indicates whether readers are looking at something that really happened, such as the carrying in of the electoral ballots, something that was purely fictional in the lives of our characters, or something that was speculative, meaning we don't know all the details. So here's Senator Ted Cruz hiding in a supply closet, which we believe to have happened based on testimony, but we don't know all of the details. And so we wanted to be clear about that. But it's also a character-driven story, because no one wants to just read a documentary. That's not what comic books are for. And so we wanted to tell a story of fictional characters and how they interact with the both real and imagined events of the story. And we wanted to do that with real empathy. So, for example, we have a MAGA voter who is there at the Capitol on January 6th, who we treat with real empathy as someone who is questioning in the aftermath whether he did the right thing. We have a journalist you'll be able to identify with, Ron, And we have a congressional staffer, we have a first responder. And so we followed those characters' journeys through the events of those days. And hopefully that will be part of the entertainment and the engagement of this story. We also wanted to give people something that they could do. So people who read the comic book and feel like they have a role to play in defending and improving our democracy. And so we partnered with the organization Western States Center to create an education and action guide, which is free. It can be downloaded from a QR code in the comic book or at this website that you see there, 16comics.org. And we've engaged in a lot of events, pardon me, events over the last 2 years since the first issue debuted, including lots of Comic-Cons. People who know me know I don't need an excuse to go to a Comic-Con. We also created in issue number 2 a petition that readers can sign digitally to call for the disqualification of insurrectionists for future office, as Section 3 of the 14th Amendment commands. 60,000 people have signed that petition. And the Supreme Court ruled on that question while the comic book was out. You and I could talk about the details of that decision if you'd like, but it's still viable for states to prevent insurrectionists from taking state office or running for state office. And there are many of those, I should note. And then we have used art for change. And so you see this is a poster created by my co-creator, my co-author, Gan Golan, and you see around the margins, lots and lots of people using that image to demand accountability for the events of January 6th and for the insurrection. Just briefly, why a graphic novel? There's a long, proud tradition of graphic novels and graphic novelists speaking out for democracy and against bigotry and hate. And these are just a few examples. Superman fought the Klan in 1949 and again in the 2010s. The first issue of Captain America, he's socking Adolf Hitler in the jaw. That was about 9 months before the United States entered World War II, when our country was still debating whether that was the right thing to do. And some people were arguing, including Charles Lindbergh, that Hitler was the hero of the story. But the creators of Captain America were young Jewish Americans who had family in Europe who were facing the Holocaust. And they knew that Hitler was a villain, and they made him the villain of their very first issue. And there are lots of other examples. This is one of my favorites on the left. Superman, excuse me, taking Hitler to the International Criminal Court. Now, in 1940, there was no International Criminal Court. There is today, but the creators of Superman envisioned the future. Again, this is 1940, before the United States had entered World War II. On the right, I thought it was an interesting image from 1944, merging the Klan, the Ku Klux Klan, and the Nazis, kind of recognizing that those were both white supremacist fascist organizations. Also, we wanted to reach a large audience, as I noted. And so this is just a few of the many images of our engagement over the last 2 years. I'll just lift up a couple. Representative Congressman Robert Garcia, who was sworn into office with both the Constitution and a copy of Superman #1. And he's now a proud owner of 1/6, the graphic novel. Cassidy Hutchinson, the real-life superhero, whistleblower who testified as to what she saw and heard in the Trump administration leading up to January 6th. And I'll just tell a very quick story about this gentleman who came up to me at Comic-Con and asked me, said, I love this issue, this comic book. Were you there? How'd you get the idea? And I said, well, I wasn't there, but I interviewed a bunch of people. And he said, oh, I was there. I said, really? What were you doing there? He said, well, President Trump told us to go, so I went. And I watched him speak at the Ellipse, and then he told us to go to the Capitol, and I went to the Capitol. And he took out his phone and he showed me pictures of himself at the Capitol on January 6th, 2021, with mayhem behind him, participating in the insurrection. And he said that he was going, people started breaking into the Capitol, and he was going to do the same. And a woman who was standing next to him said, you know what, we got kids at home. Each of us, I don't think we should go in there. I think we're going to get in trouble. And according to him, he then did not go into the Capitol, but he said he was looking over his shoulder for a year, expecting the FBI to knock down his door. He and I talked for about 20 minutes. We talked about QAnon, about democracy, about our kids, about comic books. And he bought a copy of 1/6, the graphic novel, and he left. And then about 10 minutes later, he came back, and I thought, uh-oh, has this guy read this thing and now wants to get into it? And he said, can you sign this for me? And I signed it, and he was off. And, this is why we picked a graphic novel, because there's no other circumstance in which an insurrectionist and I would have had a 20-minute conversation where I had a chance to persuade him. I don't know if I succeeded, but I know he was open to it. And we persuaded each other of our shared humanity. And that's the power of pop culture. We've gotten a lot of news coverage, reached a lot of people on the questions of democracy. I wanted to note that comic books have also been a vehicle for activism. Wakanda the Vote, coming out of the Black Panther comic book and film, was used to help to register lots and lots of people to vote. And it's a teaching tool. And there's a growing kind of discipline of comic book studies in which teachers are using comic books to reach and engage kids and young adults who might otherwise find history and social studies and politics to be too distant to really attract their attention. And then, finally, or next to finally, I'll note that the opponents of democracy and the proponents, in many instances, of bigotry are very active in the pop culture and comic book space. And so it's very important that we tell stories of democracy, of equal dignity, and why all of our voices count and all of us matter, particularly in the pop culture space, because we're not operating on a blank slate. So I'm going to stop there, except to say that viewers can purchase the 1/6 series on Amazon or at 16comicsstore.com. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and then really looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Professor Jenkins. Alan, I very much appreciate your giving us already a little bit of a sense of the juxtaposition here of your very deep interest in, of course, all the serious subjects here, but also your very real, long-time, serious interest in communicating through what some people would call comic fiction or what have you, comic books. We all called them comic books growing up, and we loved them, and we grew up on them. And then later on, we started noticing that people were doing more with it. Not to say that there wasn't meaning to Captain Marvel, as you've been pointing out, there certainly was. But books like Mouse and The Plot and so forth that came along specifically to deal with the rise of Nazism and so on. So I'm really glad that you brought in some of the outreach, I guess I would call it, in the same sense that, as you say, the space has been used by people with a very different viewpoint to proselytize and to speak to a mentality that maybe we would think of as juvenile, but I would think of as emergent, and that kind of emergent intelligence in young people. So I'm very glad to have that particular perspective. And it seems to have been a longstanding interest of yours, too. You were interested in comic books as a young man, I'm guessing.
Yes, absolutely. I've got at least 35 years of comic book fandom under my belt.
And Comic-Con, for some of our participants today who may not be familiar with Comic-Con, tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah. So the two big comics, so it's short for Comic Book Convention. And for many decades, as you know, from the time I was a kid, these were gatherings of comic book fans and pop culture fans, sometimes science fiction fans, coming together to trade comic books and stories, and see their heroes. When I first started going, the legendary Stan Lee would just be walking around the conference floor, and you could go up and talk to him. Over time, they really blew up in popularity and also became much more kind of engines of Hollywood, as the the Marvel and DC superhero movies became kind of tentpole, Hollywood pillars. Now they're places that, they're tremendous, 100,000 people coming together in San Diego and in New York City. And there are dozens and dozens of other smaller comic book conventions in other places. So they're really a place that people can come together around a shared love of the medium. One of the things I love about the Comic-Cons is the diversity of ideology, of race and gender identity. There's, in the last decade, there's been a kind of a flourishing of alternate stories and people whose stories have not been told, from the LGBTQ plus community, and women creators and others. So it's really just, at least for us geeks, it's a fantastic place to come together, and it's always been a place where we could talk about shared values, including values of democracy and human rights and equal voice.
Now, we have many questions, I know, already from our audience of participants. And Vincent, I'm going to turn that over to you in just a moment. But I just wanted to get one more question in, and then maybe I'll come back with a few more at the end. But I wanted to ask you what sort of resistance you might have found in exploring the possibility of doing this graphic novel right from the very beginning. Were there people either in the publication world or among your friends, or was there anyone who was hostile to the idea?
Well, a lot of hate on Facebook, which I'll get back to in a second. But no, people really got it. I mean, I'm on career number 7. I've been a civil rights lawyer, a constitutional Supreme Court litigator. I've been a communications strategist and foundation grant maker, and I pulled together all of those connections and networks to make this happen. And to make it happen quickly. So we actually set up our own comic book company, 16 Comics, in order to move this quickly and without a lot of editing and censorship. And people came together. We've done 2 Kickstarter campaigns, and hundreds of people have contributed to the effort. So I think people understood it. I definitely chose to call it a graphic novel so that my colleagues at Harvard would kind of, understand that maybe it was something legit, but I've gotten great feedback there. Social media has been fascinating, as you'd expect. A lot of supporters, but also a lot of, critics would be to kind of give them almost too much credit, but a lot of haters, especially on Facebook. But even that has been fascinating, right? Because it means, number one, we're engaging people with whom we don't agree, which I think is critical to our democracy. Number two, it's been interesting to see, people arguing, well, there was no insurrection, they were tourists, or the FBI started the insurrection, or Antifa started the insurrection, or Black Lives Matter started the insurrection. All of those things, of course, being most of them inconsistent with each other. But lots and lots of work to deny that this happened. And because to acknowledge that it happened is to acknowledge the real threats and risk to our democracy that we face. Just this past weekend, I heard Senator Tim Scott, for example, on Meet the Press, refuse to commit to accepting the results of the 2024 election if President Trump did not win. That's remarkable. Sitting U.S. Senator who actually voted to certify the election for Joe Biden, unlike some of his colleagues, but unwilling to do so. So we have to have that conversation. The last thing I'll say about Facebook is that I think a lot of the kind of trolls and critics don't recognize that the more they engage on Facebook, the more visibility the project gets, because that's the way the Facebook algorithm works. And so in some ways, I need to thank them for their vitriol, because they've helped us to sell a lot more comic books.
Yes, just spell the name right. As we say, it's hard to miss with 1-6. All right, Vincent, I'm sure we have some questions from some of our participants. I want to give them an opportunity here.
Sure. So this first question comes from Warren Dent. They are very supportive of the issues, and I'm wondering how successful the series have been so far, and if there will be further issues. So they're contributing to the Kickstarter campaign, so they want to know how that is going.
Oh, thank you so much. Well, I think it was Warren. Is that the
Warren?
Warren. Thank you so much. Yeah, it's so as to the Kickstarter campaign, this is our second one. The first one was very successful. The second one, we're just $500 away from reaching our goal. So thank you so much for contributing. But in terms of the series, yeah, it's been really successful. We've been selling mostly on Amazon and as I mentioned on 16comicsstore.com, and sold thousands and thousands of issues. Comic book stores, interestingly, have been harder to crack for reasons of distribution networks that I won't bore you with. But I hope people watching this webinar will go to your local comic book store and ask for it, ask if they have it, and if they don't, ask them to order it. So that's been kind of an interesting impediment. But the nice thing, one of the benefits of the 21st century is we were able to set up the comic book and sales and jump right in a way that would have been much more difficult a couple of decades ago. So I'm quite pleased. There are going to be 4 issues in total. So issues 1 and 2 are out, and you can buy them today. Issue 3, we are sprinting to try to get out by the July 4th holiday, Independence Day. We'll see. And we want to get issue 4, which will be the final issue, out before Election Day. So all the support, and both moral support, financial support, and lifting up and telling the story are really helpful. So thank you for your contribution.
Right, and the second part of that question was, how is the current presidential campaign atmosphere affecting your creative process and reader feedback?
Sorry, let's say one more time. How is what affecting our process?
How is the current presidential campaign atmosphere affecting your creative process and your reader feedback?
Yeah, so much to say there. I'll try to keep my comments succinct. So yeah, when we started writing this series, it felt much more like science fiction than it does today, on my view, unfortunately, in terms of the kind of continuation of authoritarian rhetoric and threats of violence, threats against the media, political violence. And in terms of the election, yeah, I mean, throughout this series, something will happen out in the world, and we'll go back and change the script for the coming issue. And then we'll have to decide, do we have room to include this? At one point, our main artist, Will Rosado, said, this is starting to look like a lawyer's PowerPoint, which was, cut me to the quick, but it was also accurate. And so we had to strip some of it out. So we're definitely, including things as they're discussed and debated in the campaign. So it's definitely having an effect, and it's continuing to drive interest in the series, which is good for the series, but not necessarily good for democracy.
Right. Another question we received is this book, this graphic novel, going to be in school libraries, and have there been objections to contributing to school libraries?
Yeah, thanks for that. So it is available. It's in some school libraries, both college and high school. And it's also available on something called Library Pass, which is a great service where schools, teachers, and librarians can access digital comic books at very low cost per read. And so 1/6 issues 1 and 2 is available there. And so we're hoping that schools around the country will incorporate it. And we've been marketing to teachers, both university professors, teachers, librarians, and high school teachers. We haven't gotten any pushback yet, but with an exception, that one exception that I can think of. But also we haven't reached all the places yet that we want to go, and so we have a plan in the event that there is censorship of the book, but we have not yet experienced that.
Okay. Well, thank you. Another comment that we received, another question, was that John Lewis did some great work in graphic novels about the civil rights movement as well. So it is not uncommon for graphic novels to take on issues such as these.
No, that's right. John Lewis did the award-winning March series, autobiographical, but also about the civil rights and voting rights movement, and then a follow-up series, Run. And, he was inspired in part by a comic book from the 1950s, I believe 1956, called The Montgomery Story, which was about Martin Luther King Jr. and Rosa Parks and their colleagues taking on segregation, in that instance, bus segregation in Montgomery, Alabama, and about the nonviolent method, the method of nonviolent change. And that comic book was used all over the South and in other places in the 50s. For people some of whom their literacy rates were low because of the terrible segregated schools that they had access to. And so that book was used as almost an instruction manual on how to challenge segregation. And it became part of, that larger and really revolutionary effort. When the Arab Spring occurred in the 2010s, I guess it was, many people who were organizing in the Middle East and the Arab world for democracy had a translated version in Arabic, a copy of which I actually have at home, that they were using to power their protests and inform their strategies. So there is a long history of which John Lewis was, of course, both personally a heroic part and as a graphic novel writer was a part of the storytelling tradition.
Very interesting. I didn't realize the Arab Spring part of it.
Yeah.
Another question that we received is quickly, can we follow January 6 comments or January 6 comics on Facebook?
Yes. So we're on social media. We're on Facebook at 16 Comics, ONESIX. COMICS, and similarly on Instagram and X and Threads, we're on at 16 Comics.
Cool. Earlier, you showed a slide of photos with people holding up black and white posters. You said your co-creator of January 6 created them, or 16 created them. Are those available to purchase anywhere?
We haven't yet made. We gave a bunch away to activist groups. But if you reach out to us on Facebook, we're making them available primarily for activists and organizers. But it's we maybe need to start making them available for sale as well. So but feel free to DM us and we'll see if we can get you a copy. And actually, that reminds me of something I wanted to mention, which is that would be due to generous support from a number of foundations. We've made thousands of free copies of the series available, as I mentioned, to libraries and universities and to some high schools. We also sent issue 1 to 150 plus election deniers who are still in Congress, who were either elected or reelected in 2022, and to a number of other election deniers. And then we also sent them to democracy heroes in both parties, Democrats and Republicans who stood up for democracy on January 6th and beyond. We wanted them to have copies as well.
Yes, I know that you sent us copies as well, so I have them here with me, and thank you for that.
Yes.
Another question that we received here is a huge problem in our recent political discourse has been breaking into siloed information spheres. Is the comic book finding an audience beyond the liberal or progressive choir?
Yes, and that is one of them. That siloization of media and communications, media consumption and communications is one of the reasons why we chose a comic book. And so in addition to the story I told about the gentleman who was actually, an insurrectionist, was at the, participated in the insurrection, who nonetheless bought our comic book and, got my signature, which was, just kind of wonderful anecdotal proof. But when I look at where the comic book is, has been purchased, where it's been given away, my engagements at San Diego Comic-Con and New York Comic-Con, but also Baltimore Comic-Con and other places, we are absolutely reaching people who are not part of the progressive base, who are not only Democrats. I'm an independent myself, so I'm not a member of either party, but we're reaching people in all of those groups, and it's really our design to both empower the base of people, whatever their political party, the base of people who care about our democracy, and we know that there are people in both parties and lots of independents who fall into that category, and to reach and engage people who are either disengaged or undecided or confused or just not paying attention, who love our democracy but not paying attention to the threats. And so far I feel pretty good about our success in doing that.
Great. As a reminder, we've gotten a few comments. This recording or this webinar will be recorded and posted to our website and also our YouTube page. So it'll be available in the next day or so for sharing for other audience members. Do you have additional complex or legal topics in the queue you'd like to explore via this graphic novel format, for instance, immigration policy, climate change, or ranked choice voting?
Yeah, that's a great question. First I just got to get through these next two issues and this election. But I definitely, as I noted, I've always been a comic book fan. I never thought of myself as a comic book creator, but now that I'm in it, I think I enjoy the creative process much more than I expected. And I think it's a fantastic medium for lots of reasons, right? It doesn't require a degree of literacy. It can be translated into multiple languages. It can, tell a story across ages. If you're, 80 years old in the United States, you grew up with comic books. If you're 8 years old, you're growing up around comic books and in kind of a comic book era. So I would love to explore some of those issues. My co-writer, Gan Golan, is a climate justice activist and a graphic novelist and a talented artist, which I'm not. And so, we haven't committed to anything, but I think, climate issues would be a great topic and important topic to take on in this way. Others are doing so, I should note, both in terms of the immigrant experience and immigrant human rights issues and climate. And so but nobody seemed to have been taking on the insurrection and our threats to democracy, which is why we gravitated towards it. So we'll take a look at the landscape, and I think if we can contribute, we'll definitely consider it.
Right, and I think this is successful enough where it merits more in this medium. Are there any other historical events you would like to see written about in this form, and which would lend themselves to this particular form, the graphic novels?
Yeah, that's a great question. When I was a kid, there was a comic book series called Golden Legacy, which was about they were biographies of Black leaders, so Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass and the like. And my dad got me the whole set, and it was crucial because back in the day, I'm old. Back in the day, you had no access to these these stories at all. Even decades later, it was just kind of during a couple of weeks during Black History Month. And so I'd like to revisit in comic book form the period of Reconstruction of our nation after the Civil War. Most people don't recognize that remarkable 12-year period, 1865 to 1877, in which Black men were able to vote for the first time en masse. There were Black men elected to the U.S. Congress for the first time. So when you hear that somebody is the first African-American elected to office since Reconstruction, that's what that means. During Reconstruction, there was, a dozen and more people elected. People in state legislatures in the South passed, public education and public health legislation for the first time. And then it all ended when, with the Compromise of 1877, and federal troops were removed from the South by President Hayes. And so that story is not known well. And in fact, it's arguably unlawful in some parts of the South now to tell that story. I think because of laws that have outlawed Black studies and so-called critical race theory without their understanding what that actually means. And so I would love to take on that era. That's more than a notion, right? It's not an event.
Yeah.
It's a dozen years and very momentous. And so I am going to need to get a lot of sleep between now and then, but I'd love to take it up.
As a reminder to the audience, please continue to contribute questions to our Q&A as you listen to our presentation here. One question about graphic novels from one of our audience members who has not bought a graphic novel before asks, the word graphic, I think, can possibly confuse people and make people shy away from the novel. So why is it called a graphic novel?
Yeah. So the idea of a graphic novel is a story of the kind that you might read in a novel, but it is told in a graphic form, meaning with pictures and words, literally, instead of just words. So so this is issue 2. You see Josh Hawley raising his fist before he ran in fear from the insurrectionists. The idea is to really convey a story in a way that allows you to be there, right? That highlights certain moments in a different way. And it's, in a graphic novel, typically, something that might be, 30 pages in a novel is condensed into a page or two of really compelling symbolic images. So it's a very different medium, but I think it's a wonderful medium. It allows us to kind of enter a world, and as with our series or with Black Panther, for example, in Wakanda, to really kind of envision and be shown a world that doesn't exist, but that is a logical extension of our world. So those of you who saw the Black Panther films, this notion of Wakanda, right, this mythical African nation that was shielded from the slave trade, shielded from colonialism, shielded from imperialism or exploitation. No such African nation exists, sadly, in the continent. But because of this comic book, we were able to envision what that might look like, the scientific genius, the inventions, if they were able to use their own resources rather than having those resources exploited. And you could write about that in a novel, and some have taken up the Afrofuturism mantle through novels. But also being able to see one vision of that I think is really powerful. So it's one of the great things about graphic novels. Also, they're quick. So,
Yeah.
you can read 1/6 in about 10 minutes and go back and look at the moments that you most enjoyed, unlike the 812-page House Select Committee report on the insurrection, which I also highly recommend, but which is going to take you some time.
Yeah. Since this is for a broader audience and a quicker read, do you know, or would you recommend a certain school grade level to read these, at least your issues?
Yeah, it's a great question. We're saying 16 and above. There is some we have kind of visually bleeped out most of the profanity that was used that day that we captured. So there's not a lot of profanity in it. There's no nudity, but there's violence, right? So there is the violence that was depicted. That was perpetrated on that day, the attacks on police officers and the like. And so, we don't think for really young audiences it's appropriate, but I would say it's probably less violent than the average comic book, and probably there's probably less violence than a lot of novels that are assigned for school.
Right. Ron, did you have any other last questions for Alan before we close?
A couple of things that I'd like to go back to. We did talk a little bit about deniers and the segment of the population that has been comfortable with simply saying, well, this was wildly different from what was depicted by the committee or what's been depicted in most all of the media. It was actually an Antifa riot, that sort of thing. You alluded to that, Alan. And so I wondered, though, about another category, possibly a good deal larger, of people who don't deny what happened on January 6th or try to come up with an alternative reality, but who think it's really time, particularly after the January 6th investigation and their report, the 812 pages and so on, to move on, that we've heard enough, that it was a terrible, ugly incident, but that it really doesn't need to continue to oppress us in the way that perhaps the continued fascination with it or the continued suffering of it may represent. What do you think about that?
Well, I think I have two responses to that, Ron. One is that the founders of our country and the framers of the 14th Amendment in particular knew better, right? They knew that when there is an attempt to overturn our democracy, those people don't just go away when they fail or if they fail. They try again. They try through different methods. They try to retell their story to be benign. And when we allow that, and we see this with the Reconstruction era that I mentioned, it's very easy to have a slow version of a coup, a slow version of authoritarianism creep in, where the attempt at a quick version failed, or simply to have the quick version done again. In other words, the possibility that January 6, 2021 was will serve as a dress rehearsal, that those who seek to subvert our democracy will have learned what didn't work last time, and they will try again and be more successful. I noted that lots of members of the or at least a couple of members of the U.S. Congress are now refusing to commit to accept the results of the 2024 election if former President Trump is not the victor. That should be as loud an alarm bell as any, that it is not a time to move on from what happened on January 6, 2021. It's a time to learn from it and to shore up our democracy. And here I'm making a nonpartisan point, right? That people of both major political parties and independents and others care about our democracy, who care about truth and the rule of law, need to learn from what happened, continue to talk about and teach what happened, and to shore up our democratic systems and protections so that that can never happen again.
Thank you. I also wanted to ask a little bit about the differentiation between issues 1 and 2. I believe issue 1 asks the question, what if it had worked? What if it had succeeded? And issue 2 is more about where did all this come from? What are the deeper roots? If I've accurately represented 1 and 2, then what do you have planned for 3 and 4?
Yeah, so that's basically accurate. Excuse me. Issue 1 was set 9 months after a successful insurrection and established the world, the kind of dystopian world that we find ourselves in. Issue 2 goes back to the months leading up to January 6th, and both real and imagined. And as I said, we're clear about what's real and what's fictional. Issue 3 is about the aftermath of the successful insurrection. How do things go? And we're drawing from what we've learned from other nations in which there were successful coups. What authoritarians do. They capture the news media. That's always one of the first things that they do. They punish dissenters and they establish the party line about what happened. There are a number of things that authoritarians do throughout history and around the world, and that we've seen sometimes in our own country, the McCarthy era and otherwise. And so we depict some of those things along with the birth of a resistance movement. And so issue 4 is about the attempt to resist and restore. So everyday people coming together across ideologies, across demographics, to try to restore our democracy. And, while arguing amongst themselves about what that democracy should be. When we were conceiving of this series, I was watching on Disney Plus the play Hamilton over and over again, which I continue to believe is just genius on every level. But I was struck by the fact, and this is drawn from actual history, not just Hamilton, I was struck by the fact that the founders of the United States were both arguing about how to defeat the British and arguing about what our democracy should be and what it should mean. And so our characters are doing the same. Some believe we should just get back to the status quo, how were things in 2015? Others believe that if they're going to risk their lives and their freedom, we're going to have to create a more perfect union that includes everyone, and there are all kinds of folks in between. So it's really an opportunity to explore that debate, but always with entertainment and engagement in mind. So it's not going to be a lecture. It will not be the Federalist Papers, but you are going to see these different perspectives discussed and debated in issue number 4.
No, I love the comparison to Hamilton because it has, I think, had a profound effect on a lot of people to realize how entertaining something like that could be. And while there's departure from pure fact and there's fictionalization, I would think that would be something of an inspiration. It is certainly an adult's best reason to have Disney Plus, but it is remarkable how much you can pique the interest of students with something like that and show them the humanity of people who were alive 250 years ago, and also the issues that they can identify with that they were dealing with then. So I think that's a great tradition to be in yourself. And we've been talking about you as a creator, as a creative artist, but you also do teach law at Harvard Law School, and you are a graduate of Harvard Law School, and you have been particularly interested, I think, in communication law, I understand, and also civil rights. But you have had some focus on the Supreme Court and jurisprudence. You mentioned earlier that the court had weighed in to some degree with respect to this question of whether or not insurrectionists can run for office or whether or not they're barred by, I think, the 14th Amendment, going back again to the Civil War and all the Reconstruction period, trauma and tragedy. And so here we are today. The Supreme Court is probably just at the beginning of a long string of decisions that they're going to have to make that all go back to the challenge that was issued by Trump to much of the system and what we thought of as settled law. So what is your read on where the court stands right now with, let's say, for example, immunity? I know we're a little off subject here, but I had to tap into your expertise as a law professor.
Yeah, no, it's going to be, an interesting ride. So I did listen to the oral argument of the Supreme Court case about whether President Trump is immune from prosecution, and his side, his attorneys have taken what I would consider, and I think even the majority of the court considered to be a very extreme position, that he cannot, that any president, former president, cannot be prosecuted, unless there is first, a successful impeachment and conviction, and then there's a legislative procedure set up. I don't think a majority of the court is going to accept that extreme version. It would be quite surprising, although one or two of them may accept it. But I do think that they will probably, my prediction, it's always dangerous to predict what the Supreme Court's going to do based on oral argument, because it's inherently a testing of both sides' positions. But the justices repeated again and again, we're trying to decide this for the ages, right? Not just regarding President Trump. Now, that's a particular perspective, because they could decide it just for President Trump and indicate that they are not deciding this question as to other, circumstances or facts. But it's also true that whatever they decide will be precedent, and it will guide, future courts and presidents. I suspect that they will disagree with the decision below in some, relatively modest respects, and send the case back, which means it's going to get delayed, which means the prosecution likely, in that, if all of that happens, will not proceed before the election. We know that, or we can predict that if former President Trump is reelected, he's going to, dismiss the prosecutions, and so he will never be held accountable federally, if all of those things happen. But there is the prosecution in Georgia, which he would not have the power to eliminate. So those are all predictions. I do think that the core notion that presidents are not above the law and that former presidents can be held accountable will be preserved. One other thing that I would say about that I hope, I was disappointed when the Supreme Court took up the question of whether President Trump could be barred from office by the state of Colorado because he participated in the insurrection, and therefore, under Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, he could be barred from office. And so the court unanimously held that the state of Colorado, acting alone, would not remove him as a federal officer. The majority of the court, wrongly in my view, also said that Congress actually had to set up a procedure for his removal, for the removal of a federal candidate based on their insurrectionist activity. I think that was the wrong decision, but it's what they decided. But I was additionally disappointed that in the court's written decision, there was no actual discussion of the insurrection. So someone who reads that decision, 10, 20, 100 years from now, will have no idea what was actually perpetrated. And I think that, and even the dissenters did not do that. And I think that was a missed opportunity from a historical standpoint and from a jurisprudential standpoint. And so I hope whatever the court does regarding this question of immunity or lack of immunity, that someone will write an opinion that actually explains why we're all here. Why is the court even being called to decide this question? Because of the outrageous and, in my view, unconstitutional behavior of a former president and his minions.
But as I understand it, the state courts have been allowed to remove candidates from the ballot for state office.
That's correct.
And the difference being that they're only setting the rules for their own state and not removing a federal candidate who has standing elsewhere.
That's exactly right. And that was a unanimous decision by the court, that part of the decision.
All fascinating stuff, obviously. And I think one of the things that's intriguing about all this is the degree to which, as thorny and as technical and as jurisprudential as all of these things become, the more you discuss it, it can still be elucidated by something like what you're doing with, call them graphic novels, call them comic books. I like it either way. And it's still something that you can meet people and talk about at Comic-Con. So I've enjoyed this very, very much. I plan to watch the video myself and hear it all again. Vincent, do we have some more questions pending that have come in while we've been chatting?
The questions have stopped, but I'd like to share the screen to promote some future webinars that we have planned.
Very well, and I just want to add my personal thanks once again to our guest, Professor Alan Jenkins.
Yes,
Harvard.
Thank you, Professor Jenkins, for joining us today. For our audience, thank you for joining us as well. It's because of the contributions that we received from audience members that we were able to put on this public history programming. So we definitely appreciate that. In the future, we have a webinar on Thursday, May 16th with Garrett Peck, author, on books covering the Prohibition Amendments in our continuing amendment series. Then we have Filibustered, How to Fix the Broken Senate and Save America with author Mike Zamore. That's Thursday, June 6th. And we just added on June 20th, ahead of the Congressional Women's Softball game, a webinar with former members of Congress, Congresswoman Ileana Ross-Layton and Congresswoman